December 19th, 1992. A Cessna 310 twin-engine aircraft descended through the late afternoon sky over western Cuba, approaching a stretch of highway near the town of Varadero. The pilot was breaking numerous international laws. He was violating Cuban airspace without permission. He was flying a civilian aircraft into a country that considered him a traitor. He was risking being shot down by Cuban air defense systems or intercepted by the very MiG fighters he had once flown himself. The pilot's name was Orestes Lorenzo Perez. 21 months earlier, he had defected from Cuba in a MiG-23 fighter jet, landing at Naval Air Station Key West in one of the most dramatic Cold War defections. Now he was returning, flying low to avoid radar detection, searching for a specific section of highway where his wife Victoria and their two young sons were supposed to be waiting. He spotted them. Victoria was standing beside the road with Reniel, age 11, and Alejandro, age 6. They were the only people visible on that section of highway. Orestes brought the Cessna down, touching the wheels onto the asphalt of the Cuban highway, using a public road as an improvised runway. The aircraft rolled to a stop. Victoria and the boys ran toward it. They climbed aboard, cramming into the small cabin. Orestes pushed the throttles forward and the Cessna accelerated down the highway, lifting off just before reaching a section where trees and power lines would have made takeoff impossible. Within minutes, they were over the Straits of Florida, heading north toward the United States. Cuban authorities realized what had happened and scrambled MiG fighters to intercept, but by the time the fighters reached altitude, the Cessna was already over international waters. Orestes radioed U.S. authorities to report his position and request clearance to land at Marathon Airport in the Florida Keys. His family was safe. The mission that had consumed him for 21 months was complete. When they landed in Marathon, reporters and supporters were waiting. Orestes stepped out of the aircraft and spoke to the cameras. His voice was steady, but emotion showed on his face. He said the rescue had been a miracle, that his children's liberty was worth any risk, that he could not have continued living in freedom while knowing his family remained trapped in Cuba. But what the reporters didn't know, what Orestes didn't discuss in those initial interviews, was that his decision to defect had not primarily been about politics or ideology. It had been about food, about walking into an American supermarket 3 days after his defection and experiencing something so profoundly different from anything in Cuba that it had shattered his understanding of the world he had been taught to believe in. Orestes Lorenzo Perez was born in 1956 in Cuba, 7 years before Fidel Castro's revolution transformed the island. His early childhood memories were of pre-revolutionary Cuba, a country with significant poverty and inequality, but also with functioning markets, private businesses, and connection to the American economy just 90 miles north. When the revolution came in 1959, Orestes was only 3 years old, too young to understand the political transformation that was beginning. He grew up in revolutionary Cuba, educated in schools where the curriculum emphasized Marxist-Leninist ideology, where students learned that capitalism was exploitative and socialism was building a better future. He joined the Young Pioneers and later the Union of Young Communists, the youth organizations that every Cuban child was expected to join. He excelled in school, particularly in technical subjects, and showed aptitude for mathematics and physics. In the early 1970s, Orestes was selected for military service in the Cuban Revolutionary Air Force. This was considered a privilege, a sign that authorities viewed him as politically reliable and intellectually capable. Not every conscript was assigned to the Air Force, and certainly not everyone was selected for pilot training. Orestes was accepted into the rigorous program that would transform him into a military aviator. The training was intensive and heavily influenced by Soviet methods. Cuban military aviation at that time was entirely dependent on the Soviet Union for aircraft, training, doctrine, and support. Orestes learned to fly Soviet-designed aircraft and was indoctrinated in Soviet military thinking. He was taught that Cuba was building socialism with Soviet assistance, that the United States was an imperialist threat constantly plotting to destroy the revolution, that Cuban military pilots were defenders of sovereignty and socialism. Orestes was good at flying. He had the reflexes, the spatial awareness, the ability to manage complex systems under stress that characterized successful fighter pilots. He advanced through the ranks, eventually qualifying to fly the MiG-23, a sophisticated Soviet fighter bomber that represented the cutting edge of Cuban air defense capabilities. By his mid-30s, Orestes had reached the rank of major and was considered one of the Cuban Air Force's most experienced pilots. But during those years of military service, Orestes was also experiencing the realities of life in Cuba that contradicted the revolutionary propaganda he had been taught. The economy was chronically dysfunctional. Consumer goods were scarce. The rationing system, established in 1962 and still in place decades later, provided minimal quantities of food. The libreta, the ration book that every Cuban family possessed, entitled holders to purchase limited quantities of rice, beans, cooking oil, sugar, and occasionally meat or chicken. But the rations were never enough, and the distribution system was unreliable. Even as a military officer, a member of the relatively privileged class in Cuban society, Orestes struggled to provide adequately for his family. He married Victoria, and they had 2 sons. Feeding the family required constant effort, waiting in lines when food became available, using connections when possible to obtain goods outside the rationing system, making do with shortages that were the permanent condition of Cuban life. The situation grew worse after 1989 when the Soviet Union began its collapse. Cuba had been heavily dependent on Soviet subsidies, receiving oil, food, manufactured goods, and hard currency from Moscow in exchange for sugar and political alignment. When the Soviet system disintegrated, those subsidies ended abruptly. Cuba entered what the government called the special period in time of peace, a euphemism for economic catastrophe. The early 1990s in Cuba were years of desperate hardship. Electricity was rationed with frequent blackouts. Fuel shortages meant public transportation barely functioned. Food availability dropped dramatically. The rationing system provided even less than before, and Cubans faced genuine hunger. Weight loss was common. People walked or bicycled everywhere because there was no fuel for vehicles. The economy contracted by 35% between 1989 and 1993. Orestes watched his country collapse and his family suffer. His sons were hungry. Victoria spent hours every day standing in lines hoping to buy food that often never arrived. As a military officer, Orestes had access to some privileged distribution systems, but even those were failing as the overall economy imploded. He began to question what the revolution had actually accomplished, what the decades of sacrifice had achieved. He also began to question what he had been taught about the United States and capitalism. The propaganda emphasized American poverty, homelessness, racial exploitation, unemployment, crime. Cubans were taught that despite material shortages, they had something more valuable than consumer goods. They had social equality, free healthcare, free education, dignity. Americans might have refrigerators full of food, the propaganda admitted, but they lived as wage slaves, exploited by capitalist bosses, one paycheck away from destitution. But Orestes had flown close to the Florida coast on training missions and air defense patrols. From the cockpit of his MiG-23, he could see the lights of Miami and the Florida Keys. The cities looked prosperous, well-lit, developed. The boats and marinas looked expensive and well-maintained. The coastal homes looked substantial. The ports showed economic activity that Cuba no longer possessed. The visual evidence contradicted what he had been taught about American decline and poverty. By early 1991, Orestes had made a decision. He would defect. He would use his access to military aircraft to fly to the United States and claim asylum. It would mean leaving Victoria and the boys behind temporarily, but he believed the Cuban government would eventually allow them to emigrate once his defection was complete. Surely, he thought, the government would not punish his innocent family for his decision. They would let Victoria and the boys leave, and the family would reunite in America. On March 20th, 1991, Orestes was scheduled for a routine training flight from San Antonio de los Baños Air Base near Havana. He went through the normal pre-flight procedures, received his flight plan, and took off in MiG-23 number 722. The aircraft was armed with a cannon but carried no missiles or bombs. Once airborne and away from the base, Orestes turned north and advanced the throttle. The MiG-23 was fast, capable of exceeding twice the speed of sound. At low altitude, Orestes could cover the 90 miles from Cuba to Florida in minutes. He flew low to avoid radar detection, staying just above the waves of the Straits of Florida. Cuban air defense systems detected the deviation from his flight plan almost immediately and scrambled other aircraft to intercept. But Orestes had a head start and was already approaching U.S. airspace. American radar detected the approaching MiG, and F-15 fighters were scrambled from Homestead Air Force Base. But as Orestes approached the Florida coast, he rocked his wings, the international signal of friendly intentions. He also transmitted on emergency frequencies that he was defecting and requesting permission to land. The American fighters escorted him to Naval Air Station Key West, where he was cleared to land. Orestes touched down at Key West and taxied the MiG to a designated area where armed personnel were waiting. He shut down the engines, opened the canopy, and climbed down from the aircraft with his hands visible. He was immediately surrounded by security personnel, debriefed by intelligence officers, and processed as a defector requesting asylum. Within hours, he was granted refugee status and began the process of resettlement in the United States. The defection made international news. A Cuban Air Force Major, an experienced MiG pilot, had stolen a sophisticated fighter aircraft and flown it to the United States. The Cuban government denounced Orestes as a traitor and claimed he had been bought by American intelligence services. The United States celebrated his choice of freedom over communist dictatorship, but for Orestes, the immediate concern was his family. He began trying to arrange for Victoria and the boys to leave Cuba and join him in Florida. The Cuban government refused. They would not grant exit visas to Victoria and the children. This was punishment for Orestes' defection, a way of making him suffer for his betrayal. Victoria and the boys were harassed by authorities, denied privileges, made to understand that they were now considered families of traitors. The boys were bullied at school. Victoria lost her job. They remained trapped in Cuba while Orestes was free in America. But 3 days after his defection, while the diplomatic wrangling over his family was just beginning, Orestes experienced something that crystallized his understanding of why he had been right to defect. He was taken to a supermarket, a Publix grocery store somewhere in South Florida, to buy food and basic supplies as part of his resettlement assistance. Orestes walked into the supermarket and stopped just inside the entrance. He stood there, unable to move, unable to process what he was seeing. The store was enormous, brightly lit, and filled with more food than he had ever seen in one place in his entire life. Aisles stretched in every direction, shelves stacked from floor to ceiling with products in varieties and quantities that seemed physically impossible. He walked slowly through the produce section. Fresh vegetables and fruits were displayed in abundance. There were apples, oranges, bananas, grapes, strawberries, melons. There were dozens of varieties of lettuce and greens. There were vegetables he didn't even recognize. Everything looked fresh, carefully arranged, available in whatever quantity a customer wanted. In Cuba, produce was scarce and distributed through ration cards. You took what was available when it was available. Here, people were selecting specific items based on preference, picking up a tomato, examining it, putting it back if it wasn't perfect, selecting a better one. The meat section stunned him even more. Refrigerated cases ran the length of the store, filled with beef, pork, chicken, fish, all displayed in numerous cuts and varieties. There were steaks, roasts, ground meat, specialty cuts. There were whole chickens and chicken parts. There was fish, shrimp, and seafood. The quantity was incomprehensible. In Cuba, during the special period, meat was almost non-existent. The ration card entitled you to purchase perhaps a quarter pound of chicken per person per month when it was available, which it often wasn't. Here was more meat in one display case than Orestes had seen in years in Cuba. He moved through the aisles, each section revealing more abundance. The dairy section had dozens of types of milk, cheese, yogurt, butter. The bread section had fresh-baked goods in varieties he didn't know existed. The canned goods aisle had thousands of items. The cereal aisle was an entire corridor of different breakfast cereals, each one advertised with bright packaging, claiming to be the best, the healthiest, the most delicious. What overwhelmed Orestes most was the casualness of it all. American shoppers were walking through this incredible abundance without amazement, without gratitude. treating this cornucopia as utterly ordinary. They were comparing prices, looking for sales, complaining if their preferred brand was out of stock. They were pushing carts that were overflowing with food, more food than a Cuban family could accumulate in months, and they were doing it as routine weekly shopping. Orestes stood in the middle of the supermarket and felt something break inside him. Everything he had been taught about America and capitalism was a lie. Cuban propaganda had claimed that American workers were impoverished, that unemployment was rampant, that hunger was widespread. But this supermarket was serving ordinary working people, and it contained food abundance beyond anything available to even the most privileged Cubans. The realization was devastating. Orestes had served the Cuban Revolution his entire adult life. He had been a loyal Air Force officer, a defender of socialism, a believer in the system. He had accepted the shortages and hardships as necessary sacrifices for building a better future. But this supermarket, this casual abundance, proved that the sacrifices had been pointless. The Cuban system had failed to provide what capitalism generated so effortlessly that Americans took it completely for granted. He thought about his sons, Rainiel and Alejandro, hungry in Cuba, eating rice and beans when food was available, going to bed with empty stomachs during the worst of the special period. He thought about Victoria spending hours in lines for food that never came. He thought about the lies he had been told and had believed and had helped perpetuate by serving the regime that told those lies. And he understood that getting his family out of Cuba was not just about reuniting with them. It was about saving them from a system that starved its own people while claiming to serve them. Over the following months, Orestes tried every legal method to get his family out of Cuba. He petitioned the Cuban government through diplomatic channels. He appealed to international organizations. He contacted human rights groups. The Cuban government refused every request. They would not let Victoria and the boys leave. Orestes realized they would never voluntarily release his family. He would have to go get them himself. He spent months planning. He learned to fly civilian aircraft, earning a private pilot's license and building hours in small planes. He studied maps of Cuba, looking for possible landing sites near where his family was living. He identified a stretch of highway near Varadero that was straight, relatively flat, and might work as an improvised runway. He communicated with Victoria through intermediaries, establishing a plan for how she and the boys would reach that highway on a specific date and time. He needed an aircraft. He couldn't afford to buy one, and he couldn't explain to any aircraft owner what he intended to do with it. Through connections in the Cuban exile community, he found someone willing to lend him a Cessna 310 twin-engine aircraft under the pretense of building flight hours. Orestes knew he was stealing the aircraft, knew he might crash it or have it confiscated by Cuban authorities, knew the owner would lose a valuable asset. But he had no other option. His family was trapped, and he had to get them out. On December 19, 1992, Orestes took off from Florida in the borrowed Cessna. He filed a flight plan for a local flight that would keep him in U.S. airspace, then deviated from that plan and headed south toward Cuba. He flew low to avoid radar detection. The flight took about 40 minutes. He reached the Cuban coast and navigated to the stretch of highway where Victoria and the boys were supposed to be waiting. They were there. Victoria had managed to reach the location with both boys despite the risk that authorities might be watching her. Orestes landed the Cessna on the highway, Victoria and the boys climbed aboard, and Orestes took off before Cuban authorities could respond. The entire ground operation took less than 3 minutes. Then they were over the water, heading north, with Cuban MiGs scrambling too late to intercept them. The family reunion at Marathon Airport was emotional and chaotic. Reporters swarmed them, supporters celebrated. Officials debriefed them about the illegal flight and the violation of Cuban airspace. But most importantly, the Lorenzo family was together in America. All of them free, all of them safe. The mission that had consumed Orestes for 21 months was complete. In the days and weeks after the rescue, Orestes and Victoria began the process of building their American life. Victoria had her own first experience with American supermarkets, her own moment of shock and disbelief at the abundance. The boys, young and adaptable, adjusted quickly to American life. They enrolled in Florida schools where they learned English and began integrating into American culture. For Victoria, the transition was harder. She had not chosen to leave Cuba in the way Orestes had. She had been forced to leave by his decision to defect and by the Cuban government's refusal to let her go legally. She had left behind her extended family, her friends, everything familiar except her husband and sons. The abundance of America was welcome, especially after the hunger of the special period, but it couldn't fully compensate for everything she had lost. Orestes wrote a book about his experiences, Wings of the Morning, published in 1995. The book detailed his growing disillusionment with the Cuban system, his defection in the MiG-23, his anguish during the 21 months his family was trapped in Cuba, and the daring rescue flight. The book was successful and led to speaking engagements where Orestes talked about freedom, courage, and the price of dictatorship. But what Orestes talked about most was the supermarket. In speech after speech, he described walking into Publix 3 days after his defection and experiencing the abundance that proved everything he had been taught was lies. He described the overwhelming feeling of betrayal, of understanding that the Cuban people had been lied to comprehensively about the most basic facts of life in capitalist countries. He described how the casual abundance of American consumer culture, far from being a superficial materialism that propaganda dismissed, was actually evidence of a system that worked, that produced, that provided for ordinary people in ways the Cuban system never had. Some critics accused Orestes of being materialistic, of valuing consumer goods over principles, of defecting for refrigerators rather than freedom. But Orestes rejected this characterization. He argued that food abundance was not a trivial concern but a fundamental measure of system performance. A system that could not feed its people adequately had failed at the most basic level. The supermarket was not about materialism. It was about competence, about functionality, about a system that generated prosperity for ordinary people rather than just elite cadres. He also rejected the false choice between material prosperity and human dignity that Cuban propaganda insisted upon. Americans, he observed, had both. They had full supermarkets and political freedom. They had consumer abundance and civil rights. They could buy whatever food they could afford, and they could also speak freely, vote, travel, change jobs, start businesses. Cuba offered neither prosperity nor freedom. It delivered poverty and dictatorship while claiming moral superiority over the prosperous free countries it failed to emulate. The Lorenzo family settled in Florida and built their American life. Orestes worked various jobs, did motivational speaking, and stayed connected to the Cuban exile community. He became a United States citizen, as did Victoria and the boys. Rainiel and Alejandro grew up American, graduated from American schools, pursued American careers. They retained their Cuban heritage and Spanish language, but they were fundamentally American in their outlook and opportunities. Orestes followed events in Cuba with attention and sadness. The special period gradually eased as Cuba developed relationships with Venezuela and other countries that provided some economic relief. But the fundamental dysfunction of the Cuban system continued. The rationing system remained in place. Food shortages continued. The economy stagnated. Hundreds of thousands of Cubans fled the island when they could, risking their lives on makeshift rafts crossing the Straits of Florida or finding other paths to emigration. In the 2000s and 2010s, limited reforms allowed some private enterprise in Cuba, small businesses and restaurants that operated in a legal gray area. Tourism increased as regulations eased. Some observers predicted that Cuba was gradually opening and that the system would eventually transition towards something more free and prosperous. But the Communist Party maintained political control, and the fundamental economic system remained state-dominated and dysfunctional. Orestes gave interviews over the years, always coming back to the supermarket experience. He told journalists that his first visit to Publix had been more important to his understanding of capitalism and socialism than any ideology or theory. Direct observation of abundance had been more persuasive than any argument. Seeing what ordinary American workers had access to, and comparing it to what was available even to Cuban military officers, had resolved the question of which system actually served people better. He also talked about what he called the lie of scarcity. Cuban propaganda explained shortages as the result of American blockade, of capitalist encirclement, of the costs of defending the revolution. But Orestes had served in the military. He knew the blockade narrative was excuse-making. Cuba traded with the entire rest of the world except the United States. The shortages resulted from a dysfunctional economic system based on centralized planning and state control that destroyed incentives for production and distribution. The American embargo was inconvenient but was not the cause of Cuban poverty. Cuban policy choices caused Cuban poverty. The supermarket had proven this because American abundance existed, despite the United States having no special natural advantages over Cuba. America didn't have magical soil or unique resources. It had a market economy with property rights, price signals, profit incentives, and competitive pressures that together generated productivity and abundance. Cuba had a command economy with state ownership, political allocation, artificial prices, and no competition. The results spoke for themselves: American supermarkets versus Cuban ration lines. The comparison was devastating to anyone who observed it honestly. In his later years, Orestes reflected on whether he had made the right decision to defect. The answer was always yes, but with qualification. He had been right to defect because living under a system built on lies had become intolerable, and because his family deserved better than what Cuba could provide. But he acknowledged the cost. He had left behind his homeland, his extended family, the landscape and culture of his childhood. He had imposed that exile on Victoria and the boys as well. They had built a good life in America, but they had lost things that could never be recovered. He also acknowledged that not everyone in Cuba had the option he had. He had been able to defect because he was a military pilot with access to aircraft. He had been able to rescue his family because he learned to fly civilian aircraft and had help from the exile community. Most Cubans trapped on the island had no such options. They suffered under the system without escape, and their suffering continued regardless of one family's successful defection. Orestes died on February 6, 2022, at age 65 in Florida. His obituaries noted his dramatic defection in the MiG-23, the even more daring rescue of his family in the Cessna, and his subsequent career as a speaker and author. He was remembered as a symbol of courage, as someone who had risked everything for freedom, as a pilot who had performed two of the most audacious flights of the Cold War era. But for those who knew him well, Orestes was remembered for something else as well. He was the man who walked into a supermarket and understood in an instant of devastating clarity that everything he had been taught his entire life was lies. He was the man for whom the abundance of a Florida Publix had been more powerful than decades of propaganda. He was the man who understood that food on shelves available to working people was not materialistic superficiality, but the basic measure of whether a system actually served human needs. After Orestes' death, his family remained in Florida. Victoria, Rainiel, and Alejandro continued their American lives, carrying forward the story of a Cuban pilot who defected for freedom and was stunned by what grocery stores really look like. They preserved his memory not just as a defector or a hero, but as someone who understood that the most profound truths are sometimes revealed through the simplest observations. A supermarket full of food. That was all it took to reveal 50 years of lies. The story of Orestes Lorenzo matters because it reveals something fundamental about propaganda and reality. Totalitarian systems can control information, dominate education, monopolize media, and indoctrinate populations comprehensively. But they cannot indefinitely hide the fact that they fail to deliver prosperity. Eventually, people observe the reality of their own lives and the glimpses they get of life elsewhere. And when that observation contradicts official propaganda, the propaganda loses power. For Orestes, that observation came in a supermarket in Florida 3 days after his defection. He saw abundance that Cuban propaganda had insisted didn't exist, available to ordinary American workers who Cuban propaganda had insisted lived in poverty. The observation couldn't be rationalized away. It was too concrete, too overwhelming, too obviously true. And it destroyed in minutes a worldview that decades of indoctrination had constructed. The supermarket was not trying to convince anyone of anything. It was just there, serving customers, offering products, functioning as an ordinary component of American economic life. But its mere existence, its casual abundance, communicated truth more effectively than any argument or propaganda campaign could have. This is what market economies produce. This is what people have access to when systems generate prosperity instead of just claiming to. The comparison between American supermarkets and Cuban ration lines settled the argument more definitively than any theoretical debate about capitalism versus socialism ever could. Orestes Lorenzo Perez was born in Cuba in 1956. He served the Cuban Revolution as a military pilot for 15 years. He defected in 1991, rescued his family in 1992, and lived in America for 31 years until his death in 2022. His life spanned the full arc of the Cuban Revolution from its early decades through its crisis and stagnation. He saw the promises of socialism and he saw the reality of dysfunction. And the moment that crystallized his understanding, the moment that made him certain he had been right to defect, came in a supermarket when he saw what grocery stores really look like when systems actually work.